The Swahili were forced into the slave trade because of economic manipulation. Your mind is being colonized if you think either of these two, that the British sat beside and allowed the slave trade to happen. That's level one. Level two is that the British allowed it to happen by supporting it. That's also not the whole truth. The truth is in level 3. When you're at level 3, that's the truth of the matter. The British forced it to happen. They didn't just allow it to happen. They didn't just support it. They forced it to happen. And when I said slave trade, I meant East Africa, on the Swahili coast in particular. Since it was a slave trade, that's why that name has stuck so perfectly through the years. It's not, slave catching or anything. It's always called the slave trade because it was a trade. And to understand it, you have to look into African economies. If we look at it in two ways, that the slaves are either generated through war or through a legal system where someone who's accused of being a criminal is sentenced to slavery and then sold. If we look at it as those two things, as the ways that slaves are generated, it actually takes the form of a commerce. War becomes something of a trade. War in itself is a trade. The slave trade, in fact, breaks down tribal barriers. So these were not tribal wars, they were commercial warfare. War is now becoming more and more a profession, a way of making money. And many African states, or whatever, become very, very, very dependent on the slave trade for their revenue. And this in itself is the fault of the European slave trading nations. So these wars were created by the Europeans because they were causing inflation and a reliance on imported goods to be used as currency. Since specific kinds of goods were necessary for the slave traders to go to Africa and buy the slaves, the Portuguese and the Brazilians, for example, often used British goods because they produced the specific goods that were needed to go and buy the slaves. These goods replaced native African currencies and thus brings about all this war and devastation. But it's carried out with British merchandise. So even the British are not buying the slaves in these situations. It's that they get a share of the profits because they have the specific goods that are needed. So basically, as Livingstone himself shows us, the British provide the goods that are required to buy the slaves through the Banyans, who are their subjects. And ultimately, when the Portuguese slave traders arrive on the coast, they buy the slaves, and through this system, Britain gets a huge profit. And the Swahili remain in debt.